The Midrash says that Hashem gave us judges and laws because He loves us. What does that mean? Even pasuk Shoftim b'sheitim titin lecha, the first pasuk in this week's parasha, which says that you should have judges and policemen, state the Medrash Rabbah, and the Medrash tells us, Omer Rabbi Levi Hadava Domer, what could you compare this to? It's like a king who had many sons, and he loved the youngest son more than the rest of them. And he had one beautiful orchard. And he loved that orchard more than everything else that he had. So the king said, No, son, I'm going to take this orchard that I love more than all my other assets and give it to this youngest son that I love more than my other sons. Likewise, the Abishta says, of all the nations that I've created, I love the Yidden especially. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, as the pasuk says, like the pasuk says, because Israel is like a youth, and I love him. And of everything I created, all I love is justice, laws. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, I'm the Eibishter who loves judgment. So therefore the Medrash concludes that the Eibishter says, I'm going to give that which I love, which is laws, to the people I love, which is the Jewish people. Shoftim. That's the meaning of this parasha. So it's not moving. What do you mean? It doesn't seem to make sense. First of all, why do we have a mashal in the first place? The reason you give a mashal is because there's something about what the mashal is supposed to illustrate that's difficult to understand. So the mashal will help you to understand. So what does the parable help us here? How does this mashal add any information that we don't see in the nimshal? The Eibishter loves us, we get that. You don't have to tell me about a king who loves his son. He loves din. There's a pasuk that tells me that. You don't have to tell me from a story of a king who loved his orchard. Number two, base the Rabbi why does it have to be a king in the mashal? Every person loves a youngest child. Number three, Gimel. How could you say that the Eibishter, out of everything he created, only loves din? He only loves laws. Din is Yes, of course, you have to have justice and laws in order for the world to function. That's why the Eibishter is not willing to compromise something which goes against justice. But how could you say that out of everything that the Eibishter created, he doesn't love anything else except for the din? Question number 4, is move on the fact that the Medrash specifies that this is a king who loves his youngest son more than the others. It's clear as that implies that what about the Yidden that the Eibishter loves, which is why he's giving us his laws, must be something about us that is similar to being a youngest child. Which would explain why even after the mashal is complete, he quotes a pasuk that refers to the Jewish people as young. Even though there are other psukim in the Torah that speak about how much the Eibishter loves us. In the meaning from the sinas mishpat, but then because somehow in the context of the Eibishter giving us laws is negia dafke dichvivas mitzadeh was in zayin nar yisor ben katan dafke. The reason the Eibishter gave us this treasure of his, the laws, is because we are like a young child. What does all of this mean? But the truth is, if you're talking about laws, a young child and laws don't go together. Logic would have said the opposite. Generally, if you're talking about courts and laws and policemen, you're probably talking about adults. But godless and seichel, and you're certainly talking about people who are intellectually mature. As the Rambam says, the Rambam says, who belongs on a court, on a Jewish court? People with tremendous wisdom. Because the pasuk says that these are people, when the original Sanhedrin was appointed, have to stand there with you, with Moshe. And imach means they have to be similar to Moshe in wisdom. So how could you be talking about a child who, the greatness of a child is not their mature intellect? So how does that link up with the principle of having judges? So the possible answer is this. But Pashas kommt aus, as the Sheiches dafke from Mishpatin Siden is nicht in Azagre Samos wie the Sheiches von anderen Unionen to Mitzvah Siden. When you think about it, really, out of all the things that Judaism is about, do you think that law and order is the one thing that's unusual and unique to the Jewish people? What about all the other mitzvahs, which only Jews do? Even though the pasuk says that the Eibusha gives us his laws, and the implication is he gives his laws specifically to the Jewish people. But the fact is that in reality, every human on earth is required to follow law and order, and nations are required to have systems of law and order. It's one of the 7 mitzvahs for the entire human population, descendants of Noach. And das, as the pasuk sagt, mishpatim bal yedom. The pasuk says that David did not reveal his laws to the nations of the world. The Medrash says, "Batzitzach das nor if dikdukehadin." That's the details. Like, for example, the Medrash over there gives the example of in a court case where there's the interrogation of the witnesses, if they know what color the stems were of the fruits that were growing on the trees. That is something that level of scrutiny of law, that's what's given uniquely to the Jewish people. But the concept of law, universal. Und das kommt Rabbi Levi sagen. So maybe that's what Rabbi Levi wants to explain over here in the Medrash. As Ihnen ist dafka verkehrt, that you'd think that law and order is a universal experience, and then there's something about Jewish law which is different. No, says Rabbi Levi, that's what the Torah wants us to know. The concept of law and order is special to the Eibusha. He finds it beloved. More than any of his other creations. Which is why he's allocated laws like these specifically to the Jewish people, the nation he loves. Which implies that actually the connection the Yidden have to laws, law and order, is even more powerful than the connection we have to mitzvahs that are specifically Jewish. Okay, so that's what he's saying, but why? What is it about mishpat, about law and order, that is so special and so unique that it belongs only to the Jewish people and nobody else? Really, it makes more sense to say mitzvahs are unique to the Jewish people, law and order is universal. So in order to explain this, we're going to see one word in the mashal that shifts our understanding of what component of law and order we're talking about. First, Rabbi Levi gives us a mashal, because our question was, why do you need a mashal? This is why. There was a king with many sons and one orchard. Was the mashal from Pardes is bidiuk uvad gosha. The fact that he chose a parable of an orchard is very carefully chosen and with emphasis. The chiduk zwischen Pardes and Sodi is was in a Pardes wachsen Peres pri ha'etz. An orchard is a place of fruit trees, which are not staple foods. As it's brought in Shulchan Aruch, they are there to give us pleasure. Whereas fields are typically places of grain, and grain is staple. You need it in order to survive. Why is Rabbi Levi highlighting this? Yes, we're talking about the word mishpat, but we're not talking about typical laws. Mishpat is in the same way as everybody needs wheat in order to survive, everybody needs law and order in order to function as societies. But here he's talking about a very unique component of mishpat. This component of mishpat is more similar to the pleasurable nature of fruit trees in an orchard. That's going to give a person pleasure. And therefore is the pasuk madgish Hashem oihev mishpat. That's why the pasuk says that the Eibusha loves this kind of mishpat. Because something which gives you pleasure will be something you love and something you cherish. So what is that? Well, first let's identify. This unique kind of mishpat was only provided to the Jewish people. Secondly, and why was it presented to the Yidden? Specifically because the Yidden have this relationship with Eibusha like a young child. Now you come on, as the pasuk indicated, and as we will unpack. So what type of mishpat, what element of law are we talking about, and why is it unique to the Jewish people? The explanation is this. There are two aspects to the concept of law and order, and as described in our pasuk, Shoftim v'Shotim. They have to be judges and they have to be policemen. Shoftim is Dayanim Apoiskim Esadin. The role of Shoftim is they are the judges who decide what the laws are. And then V'Shoitrim, they're Haroidin Esamach HaMitzvasan. They're the people who pursue the community to ensure that they fulfill those laws, and that they honor and fulfill what the ruling was of the judge. So the judge makes the ruling, and the policeman enforces the ruling. Now, when you think about that, sounds like the more important people in a sense are the police. Shoftim seinem seinem Zoi, was der Meglich, dass die Mischpate Torah sollen werden klar und bewusst und können durchgeführt werden in Leben. Sounds like the judges, their job is just to facilitate, so the community will know what the laws are and how they should be applied. Also, es kann very nice suffix, was the Mischpate Torah, because it's possible that a person might be confused as to what the Torah wants us to do. Davon haben Shoftim, so you have to have judges. Dayonim welche seinem Wort, dem Psak din von Torah. Their job is going to clarify for us, this is what the Torah meant, and this is how you apply it. And then, sounds like the people who really are so integral to the society are the policemen, because they'll make sure that those judgments are carried out in practice, that the person will accept the rule of the judge. So if you come from this perspective, it actually sounds like the police, in a certain regard, are more valuable and more important to society than the judges. Because they're the ones making sure that the law is applied. It's not good enough to have law in theory. They're the ones making sure it happens in practice. Surely they're the more important component. But the kind of Shoftim that the Torah describes, their job is not only to clarify for us, the Torah said X and it means this, and this is how the law should manifest. The details of the laws of the Torah. They actually have a contribution to make in addition to just simply clarifying what the Torah intended. And we'll get a great insight into this, looking at how the Rambam describes what the nature and purpose of the highest court in Yerushalayim was. Obviously, the highest court in the Supreme Court in Yerushalayim is the basis for the entire judicial system, right across all the different mini courts that are across the country. Says the Rambam, not just that they judge, but rather he says this. The language is very important. We're going to unpack the language. As heim ika Torah Sheba'al Peh. They are the core of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. V'heim amudei ha'hira, and they are the pillars of instruction. And number 3, from them the rules get to the Jewish people. In other words, the Rambam sagt drei protim ushlavim. The Rambam is identifying 3 aspects and therefore 3 phases of the role of the Supreme Court. Ben again, tafkid from Besna God. First he tells us, the first thing you have to know is they are the core of the oral Torah. Das ist nicht der Inen von Amudei Ayira. No, the Ika von Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is not the part where they're giving us practical instruction. This is the part that they create the reality and the foundation of oral Torah. Das ist nicht nur Torah al-Seirah, no ich limit ha'avodas ha'Torah. In other words, they're not only responsible for the part of Torah that is instructive, the practical parts of Torah, they're responsible for all of Torah Sheba'al Peh, including the things that are beyond what's going to apply in practice. Then over and above the fact that they're custodians of Torah, they're the ones who are the pillars of instruction. Their next role, after they're the custodians over all of Torah Sheba'al Peh, their next role is application, instruction. Then Gimel the tafkid as the and then they have to ensure that the laws that they clarify and that they establish need to be made available and public and known to the entire Jewish community. Und das ist der Chilek zwischen dem von Shoftim wie das bei ihnen und wie das bei Bnei Noach. So now that helps us understand a fundamental difference between law and order in broader society and in Jewish society. The idea that there have to be courts in every environment, every town, etc. There's a fundamental difference between a court system as it is in the world and a court system as it is for the Jewish people. By Bnei Noach is a tafkid from the Shoftim to din employees. What's the purpose of judges in the Bnei Noach environment? Simply, to judge these 6 mitzvahs that they were given. The 7th is obviously to have the courts. So these 6 mitzvahs, to judge cases surrounding these 6 mitzvahs, and to instruct people how to observe these 6 mitzvahs. In other words, that means the Eibusha gave them all of the detail of these particular 6 laws. But because people have their own biases and they may misrepresent or misinterpret what these mitzvahs are, not everybody has the time to work out what the mitzvahs are in practice. Therefore, so therefore, you have to have these shoftim v'shotrim. Their job is to identify exactly the specifics of the law and how it applies to the particular case that was brought before them. And they also are meant to encourage people to actually keep the laws. But they don't invent the laws. They don't contribute to the laws. They're given a law book, they're given a constitution, and their job is to uphold their constitution. The Jewish court is a fundamentally different organism because first and foremost it is the core of Torah Shebal Peh, the whole concept of oral tradition. That means that the courts were given the original scriptures, and they then have to extract out of that, they have to extract information, which includes defining the law, not just the application of the law. Their jurisdiction is not only to clarify or to apply a law of the Torah, and this is the key. They are empowered, of course, within the strictures of Torah, but they're empowered to make chidushim, to innovate in Torah. That's a completely different concept of mishpat. It's not just mishpat laws, it's mishpat creating laws. And our parish is going to tell us when they enact something, we as the community are not permitted to veer from what they've told us to do. So if they said you have to celebrate Hanukkah, you have to celebrate Hanukkah. That's what the Medrash is telling us. Of everything I created, I don't love anything but din. And the fact that din was only given to the Jewish people. We're not describing over here the concept of maintaining law and order, which is part of every society. There's something unique about the mishpat given to the Jewish people. Here, when the Medrash says that David loves mishpat and he gave it to the Yidden, that means he loves the intellectual process within the Kabbalah soul of Torah to extract new information out of the Torah. That's given to the Yidden. This is not just simply to know what you do in practice, in other words, how the Torah applies to the physical world. It says, this is something which is higher than the world. It's not trapped in the realities of the world. It's the concepts. It's Torah as Torah is, not Torah as the world experiences it. Therefore, it's more beloved than everything that was created, because it's higher than everything which was created. And that was only given to Yidden. Only Yidden have the capacity to learn Torah, not just to apply laws. Which also contextualizes why this is that the love that David has for the Yidden is like the love of a young child, the emphasis on youth. Because in the inyan from Bir halachas b'Torah is negeh beikar the inyan from gadlus b'seicha v'chochma kenal. If the role of the beis din was only to clarify what the law is, for that you need maturity, for that you need wisdom. But when the Eibusha empowers the Shoftim, and by extension the entire Jewish people, to become the arbiters of Torah Shebal Peh, doesn't even say that's not because they're the wisest people around. But that's because the Yidden and the Eibusha are one. That's because we are one with the giver and creator of Torah. Therefore, we could have access to the part of the Torah that's beyond the practical. What illustrates that connection most? The small child. Because the avasa of Tzaben Cotton is nicht verbunden mit Meile Saben und befrat Geluyois. Because when a parent loves a young child, it's not because of any of the achievements or the assets of that young child. At least not in a revealed way. The child hasn't yet shown what he's capable of. Because he's small. Why does a parent love a young child? Because it's my child. My child is a part of me. It's my DNA. And the same applies to the Yidden. And that's why he had to bring a mashal, and specifically a mashal of a young child. There is a certain love that the Eibishter has for the Yidden because we're a wise nation. Is mitzad etzem, but the core love that the Eibishter has for Yidden is because of the core of who the Yidden are. Not us with all the coatings and layerings of our achievements and our abilities. We're a young child and he loves us because we're his child. And it's not just conceptually. This is also something represented in how we serve the Eibishter. When do you see the smallness, the childlike nature of the Jewish people? When we serve the Eibishter with bittul, we diminish ourselves. When we diminish ourselves, meaning our intellect, our achievements, our emotional attachment, all the wonderful things, and just kind of let our core seep out, then we, at our core, are Balabatim of Torah. Und erfahr ist der Scheichus von Mishpat Zidin tiefer und starker wie andere in Torah und Mitzvahs. That explains why the connection and the depth and the intimacy between us and the Eibishter is dafka through Mishpat more than other inyanim of Torah Mitzvahs. Because the fact that we can innovate halacha, that we can create mitzvahs like the Rabbanan did, that shows that we are, at our core, one with the Eibishter. We're one with the King of Justice. Therefore, we can create and administer justice. Which also explains why in the mashal it's not just an ordinary person who loves his son, even though that is the case, but it's specifically a king who loves his son, because the nimshal is supposed to illustrate not just because the parent loves the child, it gives him something beautiful and important and beloved, but it's specifically that in the nimshal we're getting something that only the king can give. The bailos of mishpat, the fact that we should have authority over mishpat, to innovate Torah. Only the one who has the power to innovate can give you the power to innovate. The Eibishter is the God of law and order, and therefore can empower us as the king. He can give us the authority to innovate law and order. So far we've looked at this idea that we, as judges and leaders of the community, have the ability to innovate within Torah itself. The truth is, this is a message right across the board for all of Torah mitzvahs. That the concept of this power, basically, to have authority over the Torah, something which is manifest in every mitzvah that we do. And how is that? Because the explanation is the Chelek zwischen Shoftim and Shoftim, the distinction between judges, which is very much the intellectual approach, and policemen, which is very much the Kabbalah soul approach, is bedomet zum Chelek zwischen Naisa and Nishma. It's very similar to the distinction between Naisa and Nishma. Shoftim is in Yonam Nishma. Shoftim represent the concept of Nishma, understanding, the Verstand von und machen Herren Torah mitzvahs, understanding and making Torah mitzvahs accessible to people. On Shoftim tun auf dem Nase, das sie befeuern, whereas police, they're associated with Nase, getting the mitzvah done. In fact, Maisa could also imply imposing, compelling people to do things, which sometimes is the job of a policeman. So, generally speaking, the police represent Kabbalah soil, and the judges represent deep understanding. So you could easily argue the understanding of the Torah mitzvahs that we do is a bonus. It's a nice to have. It's not fundamental to the observance of mitzvahs. It's just that you have to know the information so you can do the mitzvah. So the knowledge is essentially just a preparation for the mitzvah, and the mitzvah is the most important thing. Therefore, this Medrash illustrates to us as that the Eibishter wants us to have Shoftim and wants us to have an intellectual appreciation of the Torah as well, and that is an independent part of how we serve Hashem. Was das sich einer von den Biurim in dem, was the Seder is, Nase ven Ishma, Nase Kodim Nishma, which by the way explains why the order is the way it is. If the Nishma, the understanding, was just a preparation because you have to know what to do, in order to do it, then it should have been Nishma ben Nase. But the Torah rather says Nase ben Nishma. Why is that the order? Because this is need, not Silib ben Nase. Because the purpose of the Nishma understanding is not only to facilitate the Nase doing, als it nur von Kabbalah soll so sein betokvo vishle musa on an Reinmischung von time im Sichle mitzad Nishma, and basically to say when I have Kabbalah soul should be absolute without thoughts about what it means and how I understand it. Nor Nishma. The truth is that Nase actually is going to facilitate Nishma, exactly the opposite of what we expected. We expected that information facilitates action. Turns out that the action through Kabbalah soul facilitates understanding. In other words, when the Nishma kommt far Nase, if first I have to go through the understanding process and only then I do what I'm supposed to, can sein as the Nishma is blaze zum Nase nehmen maybe the day Maisa. Then I could say, okay, well, the whole purpose of all of the learning was only a means to an end. It was a facilitator for the actions. But if I'm already doing what I should with dedication of Kabbalah soul, and now I'm going through the process of Nishma, of learning and understanding, then was the is and I've already done what I had to do, and now I'm learning further. Then it's very clear that my learning was not just simply a means to an end to facilitate action. The learning is valuable in and of itself. Aber die Schleimes, Achvivus, Verteinig de la Meile, is when beiden is Frauen euch die Avona was in Yonah Torah mitzvahs. Because ultimately what the Eibishter loves and the Eibishter enjoys and the Eibishter has tremendous value from is what? It's when we understand and appreciate Torah mitzvahs. Why is that? The explanation is an incredible explanation. We know very well that the Eibishter's ultimate desire was to have a home in the lowest world. Which means that every part of the lowly world should be part and parcel of the Eibishter's home. So if you've got a person who's just doing what they should, Kabbalah soil, complete commitment. The Eibishter says to do, so I'm doing it. Even though that's an incredible thing, because it shows complete submission to what the Eibishter wants, to the Eibishter's supernal will. But you can't say that dedication to Hashem has seeped into every component of who I am, because I'm not just an action figure. It also has to get into my more personal assets, my more personal abilities. In other words, in order to truly make the lowest world into Hashem's home, it's not good enough for the Jew just to say, okay, I surrender, I'm going to do whatever the Eibishter wants. So how did the Eibishter get into my world if I'm relinquishing my world in order to serve Hashem? The ultimate is that me, every component of me, every facet of my being should become that home for Hashem. Big part of me is my understanding. If my understanding is void of an appreciation of the Eibishter, how's the Eibishter in that part of the Tachtonim? So therefore, it's not good enough only to do what Hashem wants. It is critical that we understand thoroughly and deeply and meaningfully what the Eibishter wants, because that's going to seep Dira B'Tachtonim into every facet of my being. In the same way as we have now identified an incredible advantage to the understanding part of the process of Torah over the doing part of the process of Torah mitzvahs, the truth is every single mitzvah has these two components. We know that a mitzvah has to have intention, and there are two intentions that could be associated with a mitzvah. Aleph, there's the generic, there's the overarching intention of all mitzvahs, which is as reflected in the language of the bracha we make for mitzvahs. There's an overarching intention that should accompany every mitzvah, which is, I'm doing what the Eibishter wants. Then over and above that base, die Kavona Protis, was verbunden mit dem Teichen Protius, was ist da in der Mitzvah. Then there's the specific intention that should be associated with this particular mitzvah and what this mitzvah is about and what this mitzvah brings to my life. For example, I'm going to put on tefillin. So the concept is that there's an intention over there of being meshabed my mind and being meshabed my heart, that I should be subservient to the Eibishter. Like, for example, the 248 positive mitzvahs correspond to the 248 limbs of the body. And the 365 negative mitzvahs correspond to the various sinews of the body. From mention, every mitzvah refines and elevates that appropriate corresponding piece of the anatomy. That's much more specific. It's much more about knowledge and understanding. There's a generic commitment, I'm going to do what the Eibishter wants, and there's a specific understanding of what this mitzvah means and how it relates to my spiritual development and how it relates to my physical body. So the chilek zwischen die zwei kavanas is verbunden mit die zwei inyanim mitzvahs. The fact that there are two types of intention that should accompany a mitzvah speaks to the idea that there are two concepts of mitzvahs. One concept of a mitzvah is Aleph, the Rotzen Elim Baruch Hashem mitzvahs. That's what the Eibishter wants. Was in Rotzen is talking Chelek. When somebody wants something, it's not something you can split or divide or analyze or separate. This is what I want. Either you did it or you didn't do it. There's no half measures. Either it was what I wanted or it wasn't. It was 50% of what I wanted. It's not what I wanted. From that perspective, every single mitzvah is the same. If the Eibishter wants us to do tefillin, then we've got to do tefillin. And that's the Ratzon Elyon. If the Eibush wants to put us a mezuzah, then you put up a mezuzah. That's the Ratzon Elyon. Then, then there's a deeper, higher component of mitzvahs, which is that a mitzvah gives the Eibush pleasure. Pleasure is the driver of Ratzon. Why does a person have a Ratzon? Because they anticipate the pleasure it will bring them. Every single mitzvah provides a unique kind of pleasure to the Eibishter. You see this in human experience. Right? In human experience, you can see the difference between Ratzon and Einig. As in Ratzon is talking Eschalkus, when we're talking about Ratzon, there's no way to distinguish one type of Ratzon from the other. The toik of a Ratzon is gleich and alle Ratzon is b'shaveh. Whatever a person has a Ratzon for, they have absolute Ratzon for that thing. Maybe it's important to you, maybe it's not important to you. It's my Ratzon, it's absolutely important to me. Mashenkin and Tainig is dois chalkas, but when you're talking about pleasure, there are varied and many types of pleasure. Jeden kechs for an andem in Tainig. Every type of pleasure, different kind of pleasure. Und der Fall ist für ein Ilin, der Kavona Protis von Mitzvahs, der Gabe der Kavona Klolis, and therefore, interestingly, in the same way as we've identified an advantage to the understanding of Torah mitzvahs over just the doing of Torah mitzvahs, even though that has the brilliant component of Bittul and Kabbalah soil, in the same way, understanding and having the specific intention for a mitzvah has an advantage over the generic intention, I'm doing what the Eibishter wants. Because when I focus on this mitzvah and what it's about and what it's supposed to achieve and how it affects me, that talks to the unique pleasure it gives the Eibishter. Like we said before, what is the Eibishter's ultimate desire, which means ultimate pleasure? A home in the lowest worlds. Which means what's going to give the Eibishter the most pleasure? To bring that godliness into the lowest world, which includes my understanding, my feelings, etc. Okay, so now we've said that right across the board, any kind of a mitzvah has this advantage of mishpat, the advantage of the understanding that accompanies it, which adds so much richness to our experience, but more importantly, to bring Dira B'Tachtonim into us. But we began this conversation by talking about literal law and order. And the Medrash identified that the Eibishter finds law and order to be so beloved more than anything else. That means that the greatness of the understanding and appreciation of a mitzvah, which brings godliness into my brain, which is mamish dira b'tachtonim, is illustrated more with law and order than with anything else. Warum? In jeder mitzvah an anderes Sug einig. The fact that every single mitzvah generates a unique pleasure for Hashem is not a ha'ara from the Meinigo Elam Baruch Hu, each particular mitzvah, the kind of pleasure that it generates is what we call a ha'ara. It's like a glimmer of the real pleasure that the Eibishter has at his essence. And the Eibishter allein is doch poshe betachlis hapshitas. Now the Eibishter is beyond any description, any definition. the ultimate sense of poshut, undefinable. Which means the Eibishter can't really be split into more pleasure, less pleasure, different pleasure. Those are experiences of the finite reality. So the Eibishter, who is B'tachlis Apshitus, who isn't defined by anything, surely can't have different kinds of pleasures. Nor is the Mekera Tainug, was von dort werden nimshach ha'orem mitzvahs nechol b'china b'madrigosa. The Eibishter is just the source from which all pleasure flows, which, by the way, creates the unique pleasure of every kind of mitzvah. That's the uniqueness of mishpat, of having courts. In telling us Shoftim, we're not talking about the specifics of having the court system. Now, in our kloli b'shaychus against Torah mitzvahs, kanal sivdad barucha, as we've already identified, the Shoftim is capturing something that applies right across the board to all mitzvahs. That all mitzvahs are not just about the doing, but it's also about the understanding, because that's mamshich the Eibishter into betachtoin and mamash. Therefore, it's when it comes to mishpat that it says, I love mishpat, because there you see clearly, here we're not just seeing one little glimmer of divine pleasure like you see in an individual mitzvah, but no, this is where all the mitzvahs are coming from. This is the mishpat. This is the Iker Torah Shabbal Peh. This is where all of Judaism is being developed and shared and unpacked. So therefore, this is where you're seeing the source for all the tiny that each mitzvah is going to bring. Which also re-emphasizes why Mishpat is given to the Yidden in the perspective of being like a child, because we're identifying and highlighting over here the capacity of the Yidden to be like a child, have complete submission. A child doesn't think to ask, doesn't question, accepts at face value, etc. Because to get to the deepest source of all pleasure that the Eibishter has is not through doing something where you feel the pleasure. Because when you feel the pleasure, you're feeling self. But specifically, when a person is in a state of absolute pshitus, I'm just a child, I don't have a whole philosophy and a whole ideology, I'm just a child doing what the Eibishter wants, that gives us access to what the Eibishter wants. In other words, to the pleasure, that the source of all pleasure that is embedded in every single mitzvah. We always read Parashat Shoftim, the beginning of Chodesh Elul. Because Berei Vashonim, Shabbos Parashat Re'eh noch in Chodesh Menachem Av, Shabbos and Vorchim Elul. Most years, Parashat Re'eh is still in Menachem Av, and sometimes it's Shabbos and Vorchim Elul. On Afil, when Asfalta is Rosh Chodesh Elul, and on occasion where Parashat Re'eh is Rosh Chodesh Elul, it's the Sterish Tog Rosh Chodesh Lamed Menachem Av. It's actually the first day of Rosh Chodesh, which is still part of Menachem Av. The first day of Elul always falls in the Shabbos Parashat Shoftim, so there's got to be a link. Is move on. So therefore, this concept that we've discussed about Shoftim and understanding Torah and getting the tainug that is embedded within mitzvahs and being mamshich the Eibishter into the tachtonim, which is our own personal tachtonim, that's all got to be connected with Chodesh Elul. Was von der Minhage ist so b'Chodesh Zeh, welcher hebt sich an from Aleph Elul, is Tkiya Shofar Elul. One of the minhagim of Chodesh Elul, specifically from the first day of Elul itself, not the first day of Rosh Chodesh, is to blow shofar. So when I get them in from shofar, gefällt man zwei Ktzaves. Shofar actually has two extremes. On the one hand, shofar is milosha and shapar ma'aseichem. The name shofar is about the idea of us improving or beautifying our actions. Was the inyan von Tainug? That's the concept of Tainug, making it more beautiful, more enjoyable, more pleasurable. Whereas on the other hand, the actual physical sound of the shofar makes you afraid, which is the opposite of pleasure. Is that Tzemach Tzedek explains in Orat Torah, that shofar is the source from which tainug pleasure comes. Therefore, the source of something is completely beyond the experience of that thing. So the source of pleasure is beyond the actual experience of pleasure. On their fire is a metalem of charada, which is why it actually activates the opposite response, which is a sense of fear and dread. Because as we've said, the source of tainug is pshitas, which is completely submissive, completely losing self, which is exactly what fear does. It makes us lose that sense of self, the confidence that we have, etc. As the Baal Shem Tov famously says that the sound of the shofar is supposed to represent the sound of the lost princes coming back to the palace, that nobody else could recognize his voice, but the father, the king, immediately recognizes his voice. In other words, that's taking us back to that core relationship of the child and the Makir HaTainugim. But on the other hand, the name shofar represents pleasure. Here he says, the reason for that is because the shofar represents the source of tainug from which all of the pleasures will flow. Which is similar to what the Medrash told us over here with regard to law. That specifically in this context of Shoftim, that's where the Medrash tells us that the Eibishter loves Mishpat. And that's why he gave it to the Yidden. What level of Yidden? Yidden in a state of being like the child, completely submissive, losing sense of self and ego, etc. And the Medrash concludes by saying that when we interact with this concept of mishpat, total dedication to what the Eibishter wants, like a child, which allows us access to the Makir HaTainugim, the direct result of that is that the Eibishter personally takes us out of Golus. It should happen, take it from Yad Mamish.